8, 9. In 1936, Eleanor's dad, Louis Schmidt, became very ill with a liver ailment, and so I had to see the doctor quite often. And while he passed away in 1936, midway between the deaths of Mr. and Mrs. Corder. So it was a devastating time for both Eleanor and I, having suffered these losses. And sometime after that, Eleanor's mother, Grandma Schmidt, decided to sell the house and determined that she would like to rent an apartment in East Orange, and that was found at 10 South Arlington Avenue. And so Mom and Grammy, after they sold the house, moved there. So that's things became reestablished. So I made trips when I was available to go see Mom over there, and we had our weekend dates. One of my visits just a month or two before we had our marriage, I visited, and when I came out, the big Hudson that I had received from the Quarters was no longer in front of the apartment and had been stolen, and it was determined that there was a ring in the general area of people that stole cars and then would drive down the street, up a ramp, into a van, close the doors, take them to whatever garage they had, and repaint them or move them fast to get them out of the area so they wouldn't be discovered. We had to buy a new car, and that was a Terraplane, which was less expensive to operate and also to buy. And it was a nice little car, and it had an electric shift in it that was unique because it always had been a stick shift, but I did have a stick there to in case the electric part broke down, which it did quite often and rather discouraging. But anyhow, we managed. It was determined that we would get married on May 15th of 1937, and we got married at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Irvington. That's right around 43rd Street, and the pastor was Pastor Hirsch conducted the ceremonies. A small church, and I got a hold of Mr. Becker, my florist in town, who I did business with, and he decorated the whole place with dogwood cuttings. It was beautiful. After the wedding, we moved over to the Maplewood Country Club, where the Dietzes had arranged for us to have one of the rooms. There were only 20 people at our reception, all family, and it was very conservative in nature, but a very nice setting, and all our good friends were participants in that. And of course, the pictures are on the wall in the gallery here in Vermont. After much picture taking, we got into our car and drove from around 5 p.m. to Philadelphia to the Greenbrier Hotel. Lovely hotel with lots of green grass and dogwood and just tulips and narcissus, and it was very pretty. We went on to Washington 2 days later and visited all the notable buildings, the White House, the Capitol, the Washington Monument went up in it. I had my camera, where there are films of all of this going way back. Stayed at the Ambassador Hotel there. A couple of days later, we found we could take a boat from Washington to Norfolk, Virginia, and it was a great experience. We went down the Potomac, we saw the Washington's home, and then down through the bay, and we had excellent meals and good service. And we arrived in Norfolk about 7 in the morning, disembarked and got in our car and headed for North Carolina. And Wilmington was the first city that we visited there, and we were directed to go out to the beach, which we did, and there was a nice hotel there that we stayed at. We were the only occupants because it was a seasonal hotel and they had just opened, and the man and wife who ran it were the only occupants at that time. So we had a hotel to ourselves. There was a boardwalk right there where you could walk up and down and view the sea and enjoy the sea air. And then we also were invited out one evening to go to a dance there, and they were all people that owned their homes along that stretch, and they made us very comfortable. We danced with them and had soft drinks, and we did enjoy that very much. It left us with a good taste for North Carolina. When we left there, we headed to the western part of the state and wound our way up into what is known as the Smoky Mountains. Spent a whole day going across this area, looking at all the view, and there were many views. And then we wound up in Pennsylvania and then headed on to home at 10 Mitchell Place, East Orange, where we had an apartment. It consisted of a rather small kitchen, a nice living room, which we also used as a dining area with our drop-leaf table. And then there was the bedroom, and off the bedroom was the bath with a shower. And it was very nice for us. We could keep our car across the way at no great cost. And so it was handy for Mom to get on the trolley car and get to Newark where she had her job. And I got on the Lackawanna Railroad train at a station called Grove Street, and that took me into the Hoboken Terminal and easy access to my job up at Rockefeller Plaza, called 39 Rockefeller, and Mr. Dietz's office was on the 42nd floor. Might note at that time that just prior, the year before, in May of 36, that's when the good ship Queen Mary made her first voyage into New York City, and there was a lot of tooting and blowing, but we could view the ship coming into the port through the windows of Mr. Dietz's office. Rockefeller Center at that time was in its earlier stages. The music hall was there. That particular building was there, 39. And then on the other south side, there was also another theater, part of the complex, that could hold about 3,000 people. And there were some very nice shows there, too. but it did not prove out, and they eventually tore it down, and U.S. Rubber Company put up their building in its place. You could travel around underground from one building to the other. They were all connected. You didn't have to go out into the... And I used to enjoy watching the skating during the winter months. People, and then in the summer there were restaurants and cafes down on the same level, and that was always a busy spot. At that time, there were the 6th Avenue elevated, and that was the only way you could get up and downtown easily. But also down below the road, they were excavating for the subway that would come up and stop right at the building. That was still going on when I left Mr. Dietsch's employment. After about a year and a half living in the apartment, we decided that we would move to 16 Oberlin Street, which we did, and Grandma came along with us and got out of her apartment, and so we resided there and enjoyed all the niceness of it. Of course, all the furniture had been removed, and certain changes in the appearance between the hall and the living room was arched, and it was rather interesting. And the sliding doors between the living room and the dining area, they disappeared. I don't know where they went, but they're not there now, because I've talked to the present owner with regard to this. When I left Dietz, I was unemployed for about 3 months, and that wasn't very pleasant, not my cup of tea, but there just wasn't anything around to do. But I kept looking and finally got a job with the American Airlines, and I became an agent at Newark Airport, and I had late day schedules, like 3:30 to 1 o'clock in the morning. I did this for about a year and was not very happy about this, and neither was Mom. So I had been looking for a job, and I finally got a job with Moore McCormick at their offices at Exchange Place in Jersey City, New Jersey, and worked there. Clerk in the inventory department, and also my job was to go out to certain ships, mainly the passenger ships, and work with the steward department in receiving all the foodstuffs and not only that, but beer, milk, cold drinks, meat, vegetables, frozen foods, all kinds of things that a ship would need. Ships that Moore McCormick got to use, they were called the Argentina, the Brazil, and the Uruguay. They carried around, they were converted from ships that ran from San Francisco and L.A. to New York. And at that time they carried around 700 passengers, but in conversion they were cut down to about 400 passengers. And they were called the Good Neighbor Fleet, and ran between New York, Trinidad, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and back up. It was a 6-week trip. Ships were docked at Pier 32, North River, and they gave quite a bit of prominence to Moore McCormick, who had only been in the freight business, and now they had these ships, and so it was quite a change. Also, they had ships, freighters, which took the same run, and so there was a lot of freight coming in and out of that pier. It was got to be a very busy pier. There was also another service, the American Scanty Line, and there were 4 passenger ships and 4 just freight ships. And so these passenger ships, they carried about 50 passengers. They were converted Hog Island ships from World War I. And so they would run to Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and also up to Russia. And so they brought in a lot of paper pulp and fish oil and things of that sort. The other 4 ships were the Mormac Gulf Line, and they ran between Jersey City at Pier 9, Pier Exchange Place, down to the Gulf. And they carried a lot of oil in their tanks, and this oil was brought up to the pier at 9 at Exchange Place. And they had piping in this pier so that they would pump the oil from those ships over and go into the American Scanty Line ships so that they never had to go off their course between Jersey City and the Scandinavian ports. It's rather a fascinating way of operating, but very shrewd, and they did make out in what they did. And those 4 ships that brought up the oil were also ships that came from World War I. This was not a great paying job either, but better than what I had with Dietz by several $1,000s. The next thing was that we came up to the beginning of World War II, and after the strike by the Japanese at Pearl Harbor, our president, Franklin Roosevelt, declared war, and so those 3 passenger ships were taken off the run and converted to troop carriers, and my job was gone. So I had a good friend that suggested that, well, why don't you come down to Charleston, South Carolina? They're looking for people, and you know about things. There aren't too many people down there that are in jobs that are experienced. So I took the train down, and then this was the first that I really experienced we were in the war, because the trains were nothing but troop carriers, and you know, there were 10 cars, passenger cars there, and they were all old cars that had been pulled out, hadn't been used during the Depression much, and of course no air conditioning, and it was hot and jammed. You did a lot of standing up if you couldn't find a seat. But anyhow, I arrived in North Charleston and was met by my friend Frank Quinn, and he introduced me around and had me stay there a while until I located a spot to live at. Mom and Lorna and my mother were planning to come down as soon as I got set, which they did, and I found a place called the Pine Tree Inn in Somerville, which is about 20 miles west of North Charleston, where I was working at the Army Port of Embarkation, a new base in Charleston area. In charge of everything was General Duke, and the immediate person in charge of the base was Colonel Bartoloni, who was from the Brooklyn Army base, where he had spent time operating. Somerville Inn was a real old inn, wood structure, but very graceful. We had a room. It was 15-foot high ceiling, and the main thing was that it was cooler than wherever we had been before in North Charleston. Lorna was about 2.5 years old at the time, and there was a big bed in that room, and you had to get on a little step to get comfortably into bed. But we had our facilities, and we could had sort of a makeshift eating arrangement, but we could contract to have our meals there, which we did. And it was a big, pleasant dining room. And then there were nice public room with chairs, and you could sit around. And then along the side of the room there were these private rooms for sitting down and socializing with your friends, but not being in contact with others. There's just a little private sitting rooms. And so it was, the whole town, there was only about 1,500 people in the town, and many blacks, and they did all the work around, like washing and helping in the kitchen and whatever work there was. And you couldn't cut a tree down in Somerville without a permit. And so it was shady, and as a result of all the trees, it was cooler there than anywhere else. All the roads, except the center of town, were all sand roads. There was no paving, just the main road which ran through the town. This hotel was crowded with everybody that was connected with the service in one way or the other. So we had Air Force people there, we had the Army purchasing, we had all kinds of jobs that the various ones did. A great number of them were junior officers, but we were all in this to win, and that was the attitude and spirit of the whole thing. My job was down with the ships, and we had was called the Cooper River, and these ships would come up from the lower bay, and then they would tie up, and we'd put crews on and start to load freight. We were supporting Karachi, India, the Air Force area there. And so we would work around the clock, never stopping, night or day. to get the ships out in time. And the worst part is when you'd finish up, the ship would sail, and then off the Florida coast in that area over to Cuba, submarines were there and took off, sunk a lot of ships. We finished 3 ships one week, sailed them, and in a few days they were all blown up by submarines. So this is the German submarine fleet. So this was very disconcerting, to say the least. Just north of this base there was another area that the ships would go to, and this was where ordnance was for, and they'd bring in carloads of bombs. We started out loading 250 pound, 250 pound, 500 and 1,000 bombs for planes, and the usual amount was 3,000 tons, which was laid out in the holds of the ship, and they all had to be compartmented with lumber so that, wouldn't set anything off. They were supposed to be safe, and we never had any trouble with them, so they were safe. But then after we got to 3,000 tons on board, why, the ship would come down, and then we'd start loading trailers for the Air Force and various vehicles, and then putting cartons of food stuff and all that. And we'd even put cartons under the trailer so that we would pick up as much space as possible for stowage. And this is how I got educated to how ships were to be loaded. We had Street Brothers who had the contract with the Army, and they would supply the black longshoremen for loading these ships. We also had some black cadre personnel coming in from, they were troops coming in, and they were being trained in stowage of cargo, and when they went overseas, why, their job would be to unload these ships with supplies and whatever was on board. So it was an educational area, but we used to use those fellows down in the holds to handle cargo, and they were willing and did good work, and to their benefit later on. At the time of all this, being in the with American Airlines and then with more McCormick, we were living at 57 Tuscan Street. We had sold the quarter house, couldn't handle it financially, and we had fixed up this house, and it was very nice, and Grammy was with us, and had her own room, and we during the war, early part of it, we established a victory garden in the backyard of 57. It wasn't very big, but it was big enough. So Grammy got interested in that. So we had, I forgot what we had. I know we had tomatoes. And I wasn't home very much, but I didn't get paid overtime, so when I was working at the depot, so I would get time off, but I put in so much overtime that I couldn't afford to go back and forth to home. It was just too far, too inconvenient. It was very difficult to get onto a train and go that distance. And you'd start maybe at 5 o'clock in the evening, and you'd go all night and arrive maybe 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock the following morning in Newark, New Jersey. So I just left a lot of dead time there when I did leave to come on home for good. And that was in 1943 in October. And so we had the 1939 Hudson, and it was still in good shape, and it spent most of its time in South Carolina. Had arranged in Somerville after leaving the Pine Tree Inn to live with people by the name of Kaminsky. They were from Baltimore, Polish, very nice people. His name was Marion, and her name was Kitty. And they had a nice brick house, and we had our room, and we helped pay for our stay with rent and contributions for food. And then after many months of living with them, their apartment in an older home became available, which suited us better. And so we went up there, and then there was another couple that came and stayed with us for a while. He was a sea captain, Harvey Parks, and Myra, his wife. She was a good cook, and she could cook real wonderful crab cakes. Couldn't beat it. It was wonderful. We decided to come along home in October because Mom didn't want to go to the local hospital, and David was getting near the imminent time, and which turned out to be December 1st. So we did get home at the right time, and so we were happy about that. That was 57 Tuscan Street. And then I went promptly into New York to look for a job with Stephen Wine Company, and within 2 weeks I had a job. It was $65 a week base, and I would get overtime if I worked overtime. Well, it wasn't long before I was working mostly overtime and making almost $300 a week. Boy, what a change that was. But it was not easy work. It was a lot of long hours. You'd have to be there by 6 o'clock in the evening if you were working nights, and you didn't get out of there. Work was over at 6 in the morning, and sometimes there were other work that you had to do to get the things ready for the 8 o'clock cruise that came in, because we worked around the clock. The inbound freight was mostly ships coming in with 10,000 tons of copper, and they were in the form of ingots, billets, and there were some that were untreated, and they had different minerals in them. And so some of this went on barges. We had tracks for the railroad cars on the lower level. So they would come in, and then all this would gradually be loaded into the cars and taken inland for storage for whatever commercial use the government decided it should be used for. So it was, and then these crews that we had there, they were blacks that had come up from the south, and they were up in Harlem, and this was the best labor we could get, and So they were just inexperienced. Some of them just came in. They didn't want to work, but they wanted to get paid. So they had to keep a sharp eye on how they were working, make sure that they didn't drop a boom on the ship or fall in a hatch or whatever. But you did the best you could with what you got. And the regular gangs, the gangs that were used for loading the ships, they were of Irish background. They knew their business. They were older men, and they worked every day, but they didn't want to work very much after 5, 6 o'clock. They just too long a day for them. But anyhow, the work went forward, and that turned out to be a great job. The name of that company was Nasarima, and their offices were over in downtown New York, Manhattan. And matter of interest is that Nasarima is American spelt backwards, so that's how we got that name. The owner of the business was Captain Howard, and the vice president was Captain Dantzler. My immediate boss was Eddie Carroll, and then there were all the others, the foreman and so on. And but it was a good spot to learn, and you did learn. So that is where we are at this point. I'll stop now. As I look back, I've made 2 big mistakes in my life. One was to have sold the quarters house, and the other was to leave Nasarima after a number of years and go to work for my father. And I had no business to do that because I was not qualified to do work in the electrical engineering field. I had no training, and that was a stupid thing for him to suggest and for me to accept. And that did hurt after a while. Tuscan Street was not a up-to-the-dime type of house, and so we spent a lot of time getting that shaped up. We had to redecorate the entire inside. We had to put in a new bathroom on the 2nd floor, and all the basement had to be cleaned up. It was just a dirty old mess. The coal bin, we eliminated that because we put oil in, and there was a bathroom down there. Well, everything got painted out, and it was a place that you wouldn't mind going down to have, we did have parties down there, particularly in the fall. We'd buy some Applejack and cider and then get a big piece of ice and put it in a big bowl, and you could dip out whatever you wanted to drink, and then we'd dance around and talk and whatever you do at a party, eat, and so forth. We had a great time there. New storm windows. The garage was too short. It had been built for Model Ts, so we added on to that. We put macadam drive in. There were hedges all on the sidewalk. Mr. Becker came over with his tractor and put chains around them and pulled them all out, disposed of them, and so it was simple to cut the grass. And the lot was only 50 by 100, so we're not talking big-time maintenance at all. And the outside of the house was painted and with the storm windows on, why it was a secure, nice spot. And inside, you'd come in the front door, and you'd walk into the living room, and off the living room there was sunroom, and in between there was a passage which you would go to the dining room, and off on the right-hand side, why, that was the kitchen, and then there was a small area for groceries and dishes and whatnot. So it wasn't bad. Lorna and David were both born while we were living in this house, over from us, and so I used to go over there. He had to Becker's house to pick up some flowers for the house or for taking to somebody, and there was also part of his land that he sold to the town, and they put in a nice park there, which made it nice for everybody because most of the houses were on 50-foot by 100 lots. So there wasn't a lot of mobility in the grounds of each house. So the park was a place where you could bring the kids over, they could play ball, you could walk around and enjoy it. And then the town also had a policy of picking up all the leaves in the gutters and bringing them over, and then they were put in piles and consolidated and lime put on them, and they would rot out, and then these leaves would be taken again to put around in the parks, around the shrubs and evergreens that were there, and so it was another way of conserving what grew in your parks and then taking it back later on in different form. But it was a good idea. I don't know if they still do it, but they did then. I used to stop at Lou Fireker's office. He was a real estate man, and with him was a fellow by the name of Charlie Klein, who I got to know pretty well. He was a very nice person. So one day he said, I think you ought to take a look at this house. He said, I think they're divorcing, and it's up on Wyoming Avenue, and I don't know, he said, you may get it right, but why don't you offer him $14,000, see what happens. Well, I did, and I got the house, and I didn't have any trouble selling 57 Tuscan Street because it was in such great shape, and all the money that I had put into it came back in the sale, so that was all right. And then we got this good deal. It was a Dutch colonial, and it had belonged to a doctor who had retired and passed away, and it was other people, though, that owned the house, but apparently they just weren't getting along, and that was that. So we settled with that, and then the next thing you know, we were up on Wyoming Avenue enjoying a very lovely Dutch colonial. The house sat up on the northwesterly side of Wyoming Avenue, and it had a nice outlook from the front of the house. It had a lot of trees around, and so raking of leaves was a big deal. And I used to put the kids to work with me on it just to keep them kind of busy. But they did a good job, but they resented doing it. They had a lot of friends in the area, they're girls and boys, and they got used to going to the local Jefferson school, grade up to 6. Lorna did all right. David didn't like it very much, and actually he had been sent 1 year too soon. But anyhow, he repeated it, and he did fine and made out well. He and Lorna used to play very well together, Lorna being the director and David the willing person to be part of the picture. They had Lorna had a little girlfriend up in the next road, but our properties abutted at the back. And one of my high school classmates, her parents lived right next to us. Their name was Burke. I can't remember it was Alice Burke, but we had been in the same class all the way through from kindergarten up through high school. She was a very nice person. It was quite a walk from the center of town up to there, and Grandma used to do it, but I think it tired her maybe a bit. Mom used to do it too with the kids. But if you took your time and didn't rush, but it was all uphill from the center of town to our... So a Chevy, beautiful roadster became a necessary item, and Mom was real happy with it. Birthdays. Lorna was born on October 13th, 1940. David was born December 1st, 1943. And Chris was born on October 25th, 1948. There you have it. Looking at it ever since. Describe the house a bit, which I don't believe I have. When you went in the front door, there was a hallway, and then there was a couple of steps and a landing, and then another door that took you into the kitchen. And breakfast room. To the right was our dining area, which is quite spacious, with a door back into the pantry. If you went to the left, you found a living room, the full width of the house, with a beautiful stone fireplace. It was a lovely room, and it was perfect for entertaining, and we did. Off the living room to the left was an open porch with French windows as access. Going up the stairs, you came to a hallway, and to the left was our master bedroom with shower and all the niceties of the owner's home. To the right, coming up the stairs, was a bedroom where you guys had your room and also your toys and so forth that you liked very much and at hand. Going down the hall northerly, to the left was a full bathroom with tub, and that's where you guys got put at the end of the day to clean up. To the left beyond that was a bedroom, nice size, and to the right was another bedroom. So we did have 4 bedrooms. Access to the attic was made by a pull-down steps or stairs, and you could go up there, but we really never used it. It was one of those things that you try to avoid. Downstairs, there were tubs and where the washing was done, and Grandma's Maytag washing machine, quite a great machine. But I used to have the fellows come out from the pier and help out. We did paint all the walls in the basement white so that it cheered it up. It was a big bedroom, cellar, excuse me. Went out the back door from the kitchen you turned right, and there was the driveway, and it was all macadam, and there was a two-car garage, so it was a big area for young people to ride around on their little bikes or whatever toys. So we built a gate across even with the back of the house, so that you wouldn't roll down to the street, and you couldn't play out there with toys unless that gate was in place. The backyard was quite large, and there was plenty of room for the Daly's property to the back for all you guys to play. And also there were nice yards to the left, facing the house. To the right of the house was an open field covered with many trees, and this was a source of many leaves come fall. We were at this property from 1945 to the early part of 1951, when we moved to Berkeley Heights, and on 10 Delamore Avenue, and this was in the early stages, and the front of our property had a paved road, but from that point on down there were nothing but dirt roads, and one house after another was going up, and I don't know what the total number of houses, but I think roughly about 30 houses on the street. Properties were narrow, 65 foot and 100 foot deep. But the nice part of it was there was very nice people that were moving into these, and they were young people, some of them a bit younger than us, but we all managed to get along quite well. Some of the folks that lived on Delmore Avenue, I can't remember them all, but there was Ralph D'Annunzio Sr., there was Ralph D'Annunzio Jr., there was Beavers, the Amadeos, the Ericksons, the Leonards, the Morans, the Westerbergs, the Douglases, the Anchors, on Marion Avenue there were the Gadettis, the Gormleys, and the Mastersons. Others, but I just can't think of them right now. We moved into the house in March of 1951 after having a great deal of redecorating done to bring the house up to the way we liked it, and we also put in cabinets in the kitchen and did whatever we felt we needed to up-to-date the house. It was an interesting house. You came in the front door and walked into the living room, and on the right you were faced with a full stone chimney and fireplace in a room that was roughly 25 foot long and 14 feet wide. It had archways, two archways on either side of the fireplace going into the dining area, which was roughly 13 by 10. Then there was a doorway going back toward the back of the house to the kitchen. We put in a new stove and electric, and we had our refrigerator, and we also had a dishwasher which came with the house. From the living room, there was a hall closet and a hallway, and then there were two bedrooms and a bath, shower bath, and from this hallway you went up the stairs to another hallway and directly to a nice large bathroom with a great big bathtub which everybody seemed to enjoy from time to time. Then you went around the banistered hall so you wouldn't fall down the stairs. And on your left was a bedroom that was used by Lorna. And then there was our bedroom, a little bit larger. And then off to the right was Grammy's bedroom. So it turned out that it was a 5-bedroom house, the needs of everybody. David and Chris were on the first floor with separate rooms. Stairway from the kitchen to the basement, and as time went by, I was able to get Philippine mahogany sheets from my job. They were left over, and I paid for them. And then Tom Weaver came over and helped with the construction and paneling of the basement. We had half the basement set aside with all mahogany ceiling and sides. Then he built sliding door closets where we could store various materials like clothes, dishes, papers, whatever. Slide the doors and they would not be seen. We had good lighting down there, and we also built a bar so that when we had affairs, why, that would be handy. It consisted of 3 lots. On the, as you face the house, there was a lot 65 by 100, and then the lot which the house was on, and then in back of the house there was a 145 foot by 65 foot lot along Marion Avenue. So we were well protected. We had a 2-car garage, and with time we widened the driveway parking area so that it would accommodate those members of the family that had cars, namely David, Lorna, one for Mom, one for me. At this time I was working for my father again, and stupid me, I never should have done it, and it kind of put us in a hole in some ways because I just wasn't making the money needed. So during the war period, my mother and father divorced, and that was not a happy thing. He later married his secretary, Miss Knox, and he rented a apartment, and while they were there, he started the construction of a home in Short Hills. And I think of the name of the road, but it was about a half a mile to the west of the Short Hills station, and it was on a street that had a cul-de-sac. In other words, it wasn't a through street. It was on a high area, and houses all surrounded this cul-de-sac. But it was his was a one-story building, and would call a ranch style. After my father's death, Allie moved to Rothmore, down in South Jersey, off the New Jersey Turnpike. It was a Route 8. It was very nice condominiums, swimming pool, and so forth. And now we move to the Berkeley Heights phase of my life, and there were many things to be done for the municipality. Planning and police, expanding of facilities such as sewers, roads. It was a never-ending thing to be done, and so I'll start in on that phase of my life. and Mom's, because she was very active too. Now that we were citizens of Berkeley Heights, Lorna had to go to Springfield for her high school work at Jonathan Dayton, and then David went to Columbia School in town, and Chris was at home. He was only about 2.5 years old at that time. Everybody could understand his gobbledygook very well. Only his friend down the street there, Amadeo, Billy, his name is. Sometime during the following summer, I was called by Martha Pierce, who was active in the local PTA, and she was asking me if I would be interested in taking a chairmanship on the Columbia PTA, or Berkeley Heights PTA. So I said yes, because David was there and Lorna was involved in the going to school. So this chairmanship, I got to know people, and there were at least 100 members of that PTA representing all areas of Berkeley Heights. And then the ladies got into a little tiff amongst themselves and determined that they would like me to be president, which I accepted, and we got off some good programs. And the first thing I did was that before school started in the fall, that we would have a membership drive, and so we got everybody out, and we ended up with 300 members, and a tidy little sum in our treasury. But we did enjoy various people coming in and entertaining, and there was always a little food on the side for everybody, and then they could chat amongst themselves after the meeting was over. But it seemed to be that it was going very nicely, and then during the following summer, I can't remember the name, but he was postmaster, and his wife was very much interested in any school activities, and they took over what would be a fair to be held a couple of months before the school season terminated. This was very successful, and everybody came out in town, it seemed. It was held on a Saturday, and the kids had a great time going from one table to the other for goodies, and also for putting a little money on the tables and seeing if they win something, like 50 cents or something like that. But we ended up with $1,800 in our treasury, and as time went on, we bought a couple of instruments for the school band, and I can't recall other things we did, but we did a number of things to give back to the school what was needed, and we had the money to do it. So it turned out that I had the largest organization in town, and then the politicians, Ted Plum, who was assessor and also an active Republican, came to our house one day and suggested that I consider running for the township committee, as there would be an opening in the next election. And I talked it over and decided that it would be not a bad idea, and we were fed up. We had problems on our street with drainage and other things that the municipality was supposed to do and hadn't done, but had promised. So there's about 30 homes on the street, and there were all new people coming in, and the road was still dirt beyond our house to the river, the Snake River, and so there was some animosity there, and so we got together and went up and protested to the Township Committee as it existed, and we got promises but no action. So that started it, and our street people were the first to really start to make a lot of noise politically. And so with the fact that I had built up or helped build up the PTA, I put out 30 petitions throughout the town to qualify for the running for township committeeman. And I ended up with 600 signatures, and that shook up a lot of people that were not happy about seeing some new guy who had just moved in town about a year and a half before would be active in politics. But we did have the PTA organization. Later on, there was some comment that PTA should not be involved in local politics. But anyhow, while I was starting, that's the way it was. In 1953, the politics got very strong in town, and it was Republicans. That was the mayor who had been on the committee for 25 years and 16 years as mayor. His name was, we called him Tony Swenson. And then there was another fellow by the name of Vic Dunkel. And then there was Victor Castellano. And they were the three, and the votes most of the time were 3-2. So they were known as the majority. And then there was Ira Holly and Arthur Manor, who were the minority. So most of the votes were 3-2, and very frustrating to the latter two. And local politics, and both sides were Republican, so it was Republican against Republican. Democrat didn't really have anything to say because they didn't have any organization in town, or as far as I could make out, not very many Democrats. So the majority were sort of the old hat, and they'd come down and play cards in the firehouse on evenings when they wanted to, or made dates to do so. And it was a little group. And then the other big problem at the time was that the bars were open till 2 in the morning. And so all the drunks or heavy drinkers would come in from other bars at midnight when they closed, and then they'd be in town and quite often caused disturbance, fights and arguments and a lot of noise. So that was one of the things that had to be corrected. But they weren't about to do that, and it seemed like anything that seemed progressive was turned down by the majority, and the minority would feel frustrated. And this gradually, through papers and word of mouth, the public at large became aware of the fact that there was not any proper representation and things being done to push or bring the town up to date and forward with new approaches to a growing community. I was very fortunate good men to get out the story of what I wanted to do in the way of upgrading the town, and that was Halsey Douglas, John Graham, and Rusty Anker. And they were good writers. In fact, Halsey worked for the Newark Evening News, so he was right up to the minute in what he said and how he approached things. And they pointed out all in detail all the things that I had announced as I was for doing. They carried on writing out replies to the barbs that came from the majority group, and they supported the minority group, which I was part of. And so we went into the campaign, and we got a lot of notoriety when one Saturday morning there were these posters all over the town on telephone poles, trees, fences, buildings, so forth. And they were said 7 out of 10 people are getting reduction in their taxes, and this was one of the things, and they were after Ted Plum, the assessor. He was not liked by them, not a part of them. So everybody was wondering where these posters had come from. They weren't there on Friday, and they were there on Sunday all over town. So the Browns, Bill and Dorothy Brown, asked us to come over to their house, which we did. We had a few martinis, and then we got to the point where we said, well, why don't we go out and take down those signs? We don't want to look at them. And then, so I had an appointment with Halsey, so I went home. And while I was home, Mom and Dot and Bill went around, and they collected about 50 of these signs and tore them down, put them in the car. They didn't destroy them, just put them in the car. And the next thing you know, a special policeman came along, a fellow by the name of Carpenter, and he arrested them for signs and illegally. So the next thing you know, this was quite late at night, and we were called down to the town office. I guess it was about 2 in the morning, and so they were cited, and so this got into the paper, and it went as far as getting into a paper in New York City. But all the local papers in that part of that general area of New Jersey were aware of what happened, and it was a good news item involving the candidate's wife, me, and our friends. And so with time, why, this episode was closed, but when they were having the court hearing, why the mayor, Mr. Swenson, and his friends and his wife and so forth all had a special seat up front reserved for them, and there were other rows of seats in back, but the town hall was quite small at the time, and so it ended up with standing room only, and there were a lot of people standing, curious about what was going to happen. Well, the decision was delayed, and the judge brought in another judge because he didn't want to get involved in the local politics, and as a result, I think this court hearing took place about 2 weeks after it happened. And of course, there was a lot of speculation in the paper, and then I remember somebody called us and said, well, there's a law that you can't put signs on telephone poles because there is a law that says you can't do that. And of course, this was to favor the linemen that would have to go up poles to repair or whatever they had to do, because the nails would be in there, and they didn't have buckets at that time. You had a special outfit that you would strap yourself around the pole, and then sharp pieces that were on your shoes that would dig into the wood and support you. State law. So we ended up that we were fined $25 for taking down the signs, and they were fined $25 for putting up the signs on the poles without permission. Not only for the poles, but also on private property. Township committee in New Jersey ends 5 persons. So the majority, the 3, there were no one of them up for election. But Art Manor, who was in the minority and on the township committee, he was up for re-election. And then you had a fellow by the name of Floyd Fredericks, who decided he wanted to run. And you had John Amadeo, and he was going to run. And then myself. So you had 3, and I forgot, the majority had the mayor running for office, Mr. Swenson. So as the program, as the politics went on, Art Manor and I were the most active and having the most votes. So it was that Art was just replacing himself, and I was ending up running against the mayor. Tony Swanson, he had a lot of friends, so I had to do a lot of getting around and getting out the word. But in the end, I did beat him, and I thought that was pretty good for the fact that I'd only been in town for about 3 years. So we had our election, and came out this way, that I got 596 votes, Amadeo got 342, Manor got 694, and Fredericks got 351, and Swenson got 448. So that means that I beat him out. He did go out for good. Again, let's say we had a party as a result of that, and everybody was happy about it too. The following year, Dunkel decided not to run, and Castellano gave in too, and so we had 2 come on the committee. That was George Lohman and Smythe. So we were very happy to have them on board. That cleaned out the old group, the old majority, and now the minority became the majority, and it stayed that way for many a year. Ira Holly, who had not been up for election and had been on the town committee for a while as a member of the minority group, became mayor, and he was best qualified because he had everything at his fingertips based on his background on the committee. And he was a good speaker and spoke a lot, sometimes maybe too much. He great. He and Art Manor had experience on the town committee, and that was very good because they had a lot of things at their fingertips that we should do. Well, one of the first things was to close up the bars at midnight and get the drunks out of town. The police force only had 5 members, and they closed shop at 10 o'clock unless they were called out. And they had 2 old broken-down cars that needed replacement. Often neither one of them would work because they had seen the best. So we replaced them, and then we got into the zoning, and the town did not have an up-to-date plan, and there were areas that we wanted certain square footages in homes, and other areas a little more. And then there was the question of being cited by the state for the fact that our streams and the center of town was not getting rid of their sewerage properly, and we're going into existing storm sewer down in the town, and every time you got a damp, wet day, why, the odor was not good. Also faced with hundreds of homes that were being proposed by developers in most every vacant area of land throughout the whole town. Matter of concern, and the zoning was going to determine what Berkeley Heights was going to be, whether it was going to be a town of small homes and packed together, or whether it was going to be somewhat spacious. And we did finally come up where the standard was 100-foot frontage and 150-foot in depth, and look-alike housing was looked at on the basis that if there was one house on the block that looked a certain way, next to it who wanted 2 different style architectures. And then when you started to repeat that, well then the paint was different. The garage might be on one side instead of the other. Things to vary the look-alike housing. Most of the houses were split level, so they had nice family rooms and large living rooms, and they were very nice houses, and the minimum that you could have was 1,650 square feet of living area. By that means that garages didn't count, attics didn't count, or porches didn't count. It had to be side yards of 12 feet on one side and 14 on the other, as I remember it, so that they didn't look crowded. We ended up with a 7-man police force, and this allowed for around-the-clock service, and there was one person that was brought in as a special, and he held down the desk so that if anybody called in, he could contact the men in the cars riding around the town, patrolling at night. The fire department was in pretty good shape at that time. They did have a hook and ladder, and they did have 2 pumpers, as I recall, so they could get around the town and pretty well keep things under control fire-wise. As you may recall, we didn't have a big population. As I recall, the population town was about 3,000. Now it's 14,000. This all happened between 1954 and I would say about 1965. Property values were going up, and therefore we had to have a number of revaluations within the town, but all around us, Union County, Essex County, Somerset County, Morris County, all these towns were rapidly becoming popular suburbia, and there was no end of developers coming into the town to put up homes. You never knew exactly how many, but we made our best efforts to keep up with it. And as I mentioned, the zoning became very, very important. And we required site plans to come in where the builder would show us the whole complex, where the streets were going to be. We were required to know about the storm sewers. Eventually, as time went by and the sewers were expanded throughout the town, they had to be determined where they were going to be located in the street, and the connections to the houses, storm sewers, traffic movement in and out of the areas, look-alike housing, areas where land had to be preserved for possible future schools, and we were putting them up pretty rapidly. Columbia had just been finished a few years back in the late 40s, and but now Berkeley School was going to be the next school to go up, and the question is where. So we found the spot where it is, and that served to the east as well as to the west of kids that were in there. Berkeley School went to kindergarten to the 6th grade when it was put up, and then the youngsters went to Columbia for 8th, 9th, 10th. Correction, Columbia was the 7th and 8th grade only, and then they went to Springfield to high school there. Next school to be built was Mountain Park, and then right after that, Woodruff School, and then the last one to be built was Hamilton Terrace, up by the Presbyterian Church, Mountain and Plainfield Avenue. There was a lot going on in Berkeley Heights between the busyness of the Board of Education to keep up with things. Also, the Township Committee was the one that had to raise the money, and so we had to go down to the state, to the Division of Local Government, to show them what we needed in the way of monies, bonds, for all this development, and get approval. Once we got the approval, then we could go ahead and float the bonds, and we had to go into New York downtown to the companies that would be handling the sale of the bonds. Well, there were other considerations too. The parking area had to be expanded tremendously for the commuters going in by train to New York, park their cars there. We also had to expand the fire department a little bit and change the arrangements. The town meeting hall was getting too small, and office space was getting to be rather difficult too. New town meeting room was built, and we also had to expand the library for the town, and the sewer expansion came in also. So in 1967, we had a dedication of all of this, and included in it was improvement in some of the offices in the town hall itself. So a public works garage that had to be built for the equipment that was operating, and also a workspace for the mechanics to make any repairs necessary. Now this was all new to the town, never happened before. People that worked lived in town and worked out of town, well, we had to have almost instant road snow removal. 9 parts, and then hired contractors to come in and do those areas, and they were to be done early in the morning so people could get out and go to work, and also the kids could get to school. Another thing is that we had a bus course that was building up, and so somebody came up with a bright idea that we could put down macadam walkways in our right-of-ways in certain areas of the town where the schools were, and the kids could walk to school and walk home without having buses. So we eliminated most of the busing in the town with the location of the schools as to where they were, and with the walkways where they could walk away from the street. And so we saved a lot of money on eliminating busing, and the macadam was good because, unlike cement, you can make the walkway go with the terrain. So if it went up a bit, went down a bit, well, because all you had to do was put the macadam in there and roll it, and you were all set. Another thing is the congestion on the road started to build, and so Plainfield Avenue was a county road, but we got them to